So, you're into psychological astrology, right? I have to admit, I'm skeptical about astrology in general. There's no scientific evidence that the positions of planets affect our personalities. What do you see in it that makes you take it seriously?
I get the skepticism. A lot of astrology out there sounds like fortune-telling or generic horoscopes. But the kind of astrology I practice is influenced by people like Sasportas and Greene. It's more about personal growth and self-reflection than predicting fate. Think of it as a symbolic language for understanding yourself. Your astrological birth chart is like a map of potential tendencies and themes in your life. It's not Mars makes you angry in a physical sense. It's more that Mars represents an archetype of assertiveness or anger within you. By exploring those symbols, I think people can gain insight into their psyche, kind of like a guided introspection.
Okay, I follow the idea of a symbolic language, but why use planets and birth times? Why not just talk about psychology directly? I mean, psychology at least tries to base itself on research, whereas astrology has, as far as I know, zero empirical support. Isn't it essentially relying on very broad, vague statements that could apply to anyone? That's the classic Forer effect, where people see themselves in generic descriptions. How do you get around that?
Great question. The Forer effect or Barnum effect is real. If you give everyone the same horoscope, many will think it fits them. But a proper astrological reading, especially in psychological astrology, is a lot more detailed and personalized than those one-size-fits-all horoscopes. We have a birth chart calculated from your exact birth date, time, and place. That chart has dozens of data points, planets in specific signs and houses, the angles between planets' aspects, etc. It's like a unique fingerprint. An astrologer influenced by Sasportas' approach would interpret that whole configuration in the context of your life story. The idea is to uncover specific personal themes, not just say, oh, you sometimes feel insecure but also have great potential, which is the kind of vague statement anyone could agree with. Instead, we might find, for example, that you have your sun and moon in tension with each other, suggesting a specific inner conflict between your conscious goals and your emotional needs. That's not a generic thing everyone has. It's tied to your chart. When I discuss that with a person, it often resonates in a way that a generic statement wouldn't.
But couldn't that still be a kind of clever generalization? I mean, most people have some conflict between what they want and what they feel, right? A skilled astrologer or even a cold reader could say something like that and the client will fill in the blanks. And when you mention dozens of data points, that actually rings an alarm bell for me. If you have so many symbols and interpretations, you can retroactively fit them to almost anything in a person's life. It's not really predictive or testable. In science, we'd call that unfalsifiable. No matter what happens, an astrologer could say, oh, that fits the chart if you interpret it this way. That makes me think the whole system is built to always seem right, even if it has no real mechanism behind it.
I understand that concern. Astrology isn't easy to test with the usual scientific methods, I admit. It's more of an interpretive art. In that sense, it's a bit like psychotherapy or literary analysis. Those aren't easily testable with double-blind experiments either, yet they can provide insight. You mentioned mechanism, and that's a big philosophical question in astrology. How would a planet's position correlate with personality? Skeptics point out correctly that gravitational or electromagnetic forces from distant planets are negligible on a newborn compared to, say, the doctor in the delivery room. So a literal force-based mechanism is implausible. Many psychological astrologers don't claim a physical force at all. Instead, they might talk about synchronicity, Carl Jung's idea of meaningful coincidences. In this view, the positions of the planets at your birth coincide with your personal characteristics not by causation but by some acausal connection. Basically, the universe at that moment had a certain symbolic meaning. It's a bit mystical, I admit. It's like saying the cosmos has a kind of symbolic clock, and your birth chart is the hour hand pointing to certain archetypal themes that correspond to you. I know that's not a satisfying explanation scientifically, but astrology often operates on that kind of principle of meaning rather than mechanism.
You're right, that's not very satisfying to my scientific side. It sounds like a complicated way of saying, we don't know how, we just believe it's meaningful. Synchronicity is a nice concept. Even Jung was fascinated by astrology. I know, but to a skeptic it comes off as a fancy word for magic or coincidence dressed up philosophically. From a rational standpoint, if there's no causal mechanism, then it's hard to differentiate astrology from pure chance or confirmation bias. People remember the hits. Oh, this part of my chart does describe me, and forget the misses. And you mentioned Jungian archetypes earlier, sure. Archetypes like the hero, the mother, the trickster are powerful symbols. But we can explore archetypes through myth, literature, or direct therapy. Why tie them to the planets or birth times unless there's actual cause? It feels arbitrary. Like if I decided to use the characters of the Greek pantheon as a way to analyze someone's personality. It might be an interesting metaphor, but I wouldn't claim that Zeus and Athena literally shaped someone's psyche.
I see your point. For me, using the planets and zodiac as a framework is partly about tradition and the rich language that's been built up over thousands of years. It's like inheriting a big symbolic library. Each planet or sign comes with myths and meanings attached. For example, you mentioned Greek gods. Astrologers literally use those. Mars, named after the Roman god of war, corresponds to that warrior archetype, how a person asserts themselves, how they deal with anger or conflict. Venus, goddess of love, symbolizes themes of love, beauty, and harmony, how a person relates and what they value. Saturn, the stern old god of time, represents lessons, challenges, boundaries, often experienced as obstacles or responsibilities that ultimately lead to growth. It's true you could talk about these archetypes without referencing the actual planets, but the astrology system gives a structured way to combine them and see how they interact in a given individual. Howard Sasportas, for instance, taught that the planets show what is happening, the signs how it's happening, and the houses where it's happening. So there's a kind of grammar. Planets are like characters or drives. Signs are the style or flavor of those drives, and houses are the life areas where they play out. This structure can prompt insightful discussions. It's not random. You follow the chart like a roadmap of the person's inner world. I've found that framework often leads to revelations, like, aha, this part of me, say, my need for security versus my need for adventure, has been at odds, and seeing it in my chart helped me acknowledge it.
It's an elegant metaphor, I'll give you that. The what, how, where breakdown sounds neat, kind of like subject, verb, object in a sentence of someone's life. But I still wonder, do people really gain new information from that, or is it that a skilled counselor astrologer is guiding them to realize things they sort of already knew deep down? I'm thinking about therapy. A good therapist can help someone see their own patterns by asking the right questions or offering interpretations, without any star charts. The chart might just be providing a structured way for the astrologer to cover different aspects of life, career, relationships, family, etc., since the houses cover all those. That could ensure a conversation about each area, which might indeed make the client reflect and gain insight. But again, that's not because Jupiter or Mercury did something. It's because the conversation steered that way. It's like a tarot reader pulling cards. The card prompts a topic, and then the discussion or the person's own projection does the work. Would you say that's fair?
You're not wrong that a lot of the value comes from the conversation and the introspection it triggers. I actually agree that the benefit isn't from some space ray beaming enlightenment into the person. It's from engaging with the symbols and what they bring up for that person. In a way, astrology can function like tarot, or like a guided journaling exercise, to get someone thinking about their life from new angles. But I'd argue astrology has an advantage in its complexity and coherence. A tarot reading is usually random cards each time, whereas your birth chart is a consistent blueprint. It's like an energetic blueprint you can keep referring back to. Many people use it over the long term, almost like a personalized myth or story that they are living out and evolving with. And while therapy is great, I'd never say astrology should replace therapy, by the way. Ethical astrologers often refer people to therapists for deeper work. Not everyone finds it easy to open up in a straightforward talk. Using astrological symbols sometimes gives a safe distance to talk about personal issues. For example, instead of saying, I have trouble with anger, someone might find it easier to say, oh, my Mars is in a tough spot. I need to find a better outlet for that Mars energy. It's a subtle shift, but it can help people not feel personally flawed. Rather, they're working with a facet of themselves symbolized by Mars. It externalizes the issue a bit, which can be empowering. It's like the difference between saying, I am angry and I have anger in me. The latter gives a sense that anger is just one part of you, not the whole, and you can interact with it. Astrology is full of those kinds of reframes through symbols.
I can appreciate that. Using symbols as a tool for self-expression and understanding, that's basically art therapy or narrative therapy in a way. And if someone finds it easier to discuss Mars than to say my anger, and that helps them, then I have no problem with that aspect. My worry comes when people treat the symbols as literal truths dictated by the cosmos. Like I've met people who say, oh, I can't help it. I'm a Gemini. I'm just flaky. Or, I won't date Scorpios because my astrologer said it's a bad match. Those kind of attitudes can be limiting or even harmful. It's like they surrender their agency to this birth chart or use it to excuse behavior. How do you address that? Because even with psychological astrology's emphasis on personal growth, some clients might still latch onto the chart as fate if they believe in it strongly.
That's an excellent point, and it's something practitioners are very aware of. Howard Sasportas and other psychological astrologers really stressed that astrology is not about pinning you to a fixed destiny. There's a popular saying in astrology circles, the stars impel, they do not compel. In other words, the chart might indicate certain tendencies or challenges, but it absolutely doesn't force you to be a certain way. I always remind people that astrology is descriptive, not prescriptive. If someone says, I can't help it, I'm a Gemini, I'd work with them to see that as an opportunity for self-awareness. I have a tendency to be scattered. Now that I know, I can work on grounding myself rather than an excuse. And I definitely challenge blanket statements like refusing to date an entire sign. That's a misunderstanding of how complex charts are. Two Scorpios, for instance, could be very different people depending on their full charts. Using astrology responsibly means using it to broaden your choices by understanding yourself better, not to narrow your life down. It should never be, oh, you're doomed, or you must do X because your chart says so. Sasportas wrote about the houses and planets as evolving parts of life. He believed through consciousness and effort, people can express their chart in higher or more constructive ways. So if anything, knowing your chart's pitfalls means you have more power to change, not less.
It's good to hear an astrologer say that. Usually the criticism is that astrology can make people fatalistic, but you're positioning it more like a mirror. I'm still skeptical in the sense that I'm not convinced the mirror is accurately reflecting something innate from the cosmos. It might just be reflecting what you project onto it, but at least you're not advocating the deterministic view. I'm curious though, what about the fact that different cultures have totally different astrology systems? For example, Western astrology says I'm an Aquarius, but Vedic Indian astrology might say I'm actually a Capricorn because they use a different zodiac. Chinese astrology uses a completely different set of animals and yearly signs. They can't all be objectively true in the same way. It seems more like cultural storytelling. Doesn't that undercut the idea that astrology is a universal truth? It suggests it's very much created by humans, not the universe.
That's a fascinating observation, and I actually agree that astrology is, to an extent, a human cultural product. Each astrological system is like a lens developed in a particular context. But I see it similarly to how different cultures develop different medicine or psychology systems. For instance, traditional Chinese medicine versus Western medicine, they have different models, QI and meridians versus cells and biochemistry, yet each system can sometimes address health effectively within its framework. Or think about psychology, Freudian versus Jungian versus cognitive behavioral therapy. Very different approaches and theories about what makes people tick, but each can help people in practice. Likewise, Western and Vedic astrology have differences. Western uses the tropical zodiac tied to seasons. Vedic uses the sidereal zodiac aligned with constellations, and they even have different philosophical emphases. Western psychological astrology focuses on the individual psyche, whereas Vedic often has more predictive and fate-oriented techniques historically. Yet both, in the hands of skilled practitioners, can yield meaningful insights for a person. They're like two languages describing the same underlying human experience. No language is absolutely true, it's a tool for communication. Astrology symbols are a language for talking about life. So I wouldn't say one is right and the other wrong, they're just different dialects in a way. Now, a hardcore skeptic might say, or they're both wrong, but my perspective is that they both can be pragmatically true, meaning they work for people who speak that language. Of course, as an individual, you might resonate more with one system than another. I happen to use Western psychological astrology because that's my training and what I've seen work with my clients.
I figured you'd say something like that. It's a very pluralistic answer. Multiple models can coexist. It's true different therapies or medicines can work via different routes. However, usually there's some attempt to empirically verify if they work. For example, cognitive behavioral therapy has a lot of studies showing its effectiveness for certain issues. Even acupuncture from Chinese medicine has studies trying to measure its effects with mixed results, but at least they try. With astrology, though, when researchers have tried to test it, the results have been pretty dismal. Like personality tests don't correlate with sun signs or birth charts consistently, and astrologers given blind charts generally don't outperform chance when matching charts to individuals. I recall a famous experiment where astrologers were asked to match birth charts to personality descriptions from a standard psychology inventory. The astrologers couldn't do it reliably. Doesn't that give you pause? If astrology works as you say, why can't it pass such tests?
I'm familiar with those studies. Honestly, they do keep me humble about astrology's limits. However, I think the testing methods often don't capture what astrologers actually do. Matching a chart to a pre-written personality profile, for example, removes the interactive element of a reading. In a real consultation, an astrologer and client engage in dialogue. The astrologer might say, "This chart suggests you might feel X or struggle with Y." And the client responds, and together they home in on the truth of the person's experience. Without that feedback, an astrologer is guessing in the dark to some extent, and human personalities are incredibly complex. Also, standardized personality inventories measure certain traits, but astrology might highlight things that aren't on those questionnaires. So I'm not surprised astrologers failed to match profiles perfectly. It doesn't necessarily mean the art is worthless, just that it doesn't translate to that kind of test well. That said, I fully acknowledge astrology isn't a science. It's more a mix of art, intuition, and symbolic analysis. If someone demands rigorous scientific proof for everything they use, astrology will fall short for them. It really comes down to personal resonance. Some people find it uncannily accurate or helpful, others see nothing in it. And that's okay by me. If astrology isn't someone's cup of tea for self-understanding, there are plenty of other methods out there.
Fair enough. I appreciate that you're not trying to claim astrology is something it isn't. You're basically saying it's a tool for meaning, insight, storytelling, and it either subjectively works for you or it doesn't. I can live with that. My main issue is when astrologers or horoscope columns try to make definitive claims like, you will meet a tall, dark stranger, or Leos are all egomaniacs, or pretend to be as reliable as, say, an astronomer or a psychologist. That's when I roll my eyes. But your approach is more nuanced. It almost sounds like a form of therapy or coaching with a mythic twist.
Yes, exactly. In fact, many psychological astrologers do have training in counseling or therapy. We often refer to what we do as a kind of therapeutic practice. The astrological chart is just a starting point for a conversation. And a good astrologer will never tell someone this is absolutely what will happen or box them into a stereotype. Instead, it's about exploring possibilities. For example, if I see certain patterns, I might say, some people with this kind of chart energy experience it as X, others as Y. Do either of those resonate with you? It's collaborative. And if the person says no, not really, then we explore other angles. Maybe I misinterpreted, or maybe that energy is manifesting in a different way for them. It's flexible. The aim is to shine a light on parts of the psyche or life that might be hidden or hard to articulate without a symbol to grab onto. Like any tool, it can be misused or done poorly, but when done well, I've seen it help people have real aha moments.
I can respect that. It sounds more reasonable than the stereotype of an astrologer rattling off doomed prophecies. We're probably still going to disagree on whether the stars and planets have anything to do with it, but I see that at least your brand of astrology isn't about abdicating personal responsibility or scientific thinking. You treat it as a complementary perspective, almost like an art form or poetic framework for self-reflection. I might still personally prefer to stick with proven psychological tools, but I won't call you crazy for finding value in a symbolic system. I just hope people using astrology keep their critical thinking hats on, like you do, and don't fall into the trap of, say, not going to the doctor because their horoscope said they're fine, or something dangerous like that.
Absolutely. Critical thinking and common sense should never be thrown out. I often tell clients, use the astrology if it helps you understand yourself or make a wise decision. But don't ever use it to avoid responsibility or as the final word on anything. It's one lens to look through, not the only lens, and certainly not a substitute for medical advice or practical action. I'm glad you see it as a poetic framework because that's really how I feel about it. As Howard Sasportas emphasized, astrology's value is in illuminating your inner landscape. It's a map, but you're the one who has to walk the terrain. If someone's chart suggests they have a talent for music, for example, that talent won't magically manifest unless they actually practice and pursue it. The chart would just be pointing it out. Likewise, if it shows a potential challenge, it's there to highlight it so you can work through it, not succumb to it.
That makes sense. Well, I have to say this has been more enlightening than I expected. I came in ready to push back on astrology as all bunk, and I still have my doubts about the cosmic side of it. But you've presented a thoughtful case for its psychological usefulness. I've learned that there's a branch of astrology that basically acts as a tool for self-reflection, not fortune-telling mumbo-jumbo.
I'm really glad you gave me the chance to explain. I know to a scientifically minded person, even this psychological astrology stuff can sound far-fetched. But it comes from a sincere place of wanting to help people know themselves. And it's continually evolving. Modern astrologers are well aware of the criticisms, and many of us incorporate those feedbacks, like being careful about the Forer effect, being clear that it's not science, and so on. We're not all mystical crystal gazers. Not that there's anything wrong with crystals either, but you get my drift.
Aha, yes. It's good to know there's a grounded side to this field. Who knows? Maybe one day someone will devise a clever way to test some aspect of astrology that could bridge the gap a bit. Or maybe not. Maybe it will always live in that subjective meaning realm. Either way, I can accept that it has its place for some people.
And I can accept that a healthy dose of skepticism is useful, especially if it keeps astrology practitioners honest and humble. Not everything should be accepted at face value. A bit of friction between skeptics and astrologers can actually be a good thing, I think. It challenges us to be clearer about what we do and don't claim.
I agree. This has been a lively debate, and I appreciate that it stayed rational and cordial. We definitely poked at each other's arguments, but I never felt it got hostile.
Same here. It's refreshing to have a civil conversation about a controversial topic. Thanks for listening to my perspective even if it's not your cup of tea.
And thank you for listening to my criticisms without just dismissing me as close-minded. I still won't be consulting the horoscope page anytime soon, but I've gained a bit more respect for the nuanced approach you describe.
Fair enough. Astrology isn't going anywhere after thousands of years, but neither is scientific skepticism, and both, in their own ways, seek truth and understanding. Maybe in the grand scheme they complement each other by keeping people balanced between imagination and evidence.
That's an interesting way to look at it. On that note of balance, shall we agree to disagree, or at least agree that this was worth talking about?
Agreed. It was definitely worth it. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll peek at your birth chart out of curiosity.
Never say never. I might, just for fun, with a very skeptical eye.
That's all I ask, an open but discerning mind. Sounds like a good balance.
Indeed. Until next time, maybe we'll tackle another big topic. Thanks again.
Thank you. Until next time.